think that's why a lot of historians think they don't use theory, or think that theory isn't part of them, because they associate theory with that idea of turning human beings into numbers. There's a fantastic book by Alan Bogue that I use sometimes called Cleo and the Bitch Goddess, and it's about, you know, how afraid historians are of quantification. And I think cultural historians especially, and maybe you could speak to this, are concerned about the negative effects of trying to quantify cultural trends. So is there a sense that theory is dangerous, or theory could have not just incorrect answers, but could actually be very have an actual negative effect on the people that history is supposed to be helping? Do you have any concerns about quantification like that?
I've never really thought about it in those terms. I'm in two minds about quantification, and I was really enthusiastic about it, particularly in the early sort of stages of digitization and thinking about what new quantitative things can we do now that we have access to sources this way. And I do still feel really, really sort of optimistic and enthusiastic about that, because I think it's, in some respects, it's the only way to deal with scale. It's sort of like, as you were saying, right? You know, if you look at it in a newspaper running over, you know, an entire century, how many, you know, thousands or millions of articles do we have there? You know, way more than I can ever read, way more than I could ever cite in an argument. And so, yeah, I'm always looking for ways that I can sort of demonstrate that the small examples I'm using are representative of a wider phenomenon. And quantification is a really useful way of doing that. I think it can potentially reveal patterns. I think that the challenge comes in figuring out what can we and can't we measure. You know, like what is quantifiable, and what kind of arguments can we make with it. And I think done right, we can make arguments about, say, how the content of a newspaper changes over time, how often a certain phrase or person or thing is mentioned. And that's useful, right? To know if a certain thing enters the zeitgeist or disappears, or how it circulates. That absolutely, I think, quantifying that with some healthy skepticism about what are we actually quantifying is fine. But then, yeah, when you get the more complex things where people are trying to quantify happiness or measuring sentiment automatically in a very quantifiable way, I think that's interesting. And I really like that research in the sense that I think they're doing some really cool stuff. But I think often it leads to quite unconvincing arguments for me. And so that quantification, I think it is potentially exciting, but it's something that I think people can do wrong. Really, they can sort of run away with a particular theory that they think is going to universe. Yeah, let's take the happiness one, for example, right? You know, so there was this. So you remember there's this sort of article published by computer scientists recently saying that we were happiest in the 1880s, based on measuring millions of pages of newspapers and books and using, I forget the details here, some kind of metric that says happiness is expressed with this particular type of language. And therefore, if we see those words, those phrases being used more in a certain time, then we can conclude that the people are more happy. And that's kind of interesting, right? Wouldn't it be nice to know when we were happiest? I think that's kind of a curious thing. First things first, I don't even really know what happiness is in general, right? That's just not a thing that I could ever pin down. But even if we could, there are then those questions of like, who are newspapers representing? You know, are we measuring changes in the press? Are we measuring changes in wider culture? There are just so many issues there for me with that methodology, if you want it to provide a simple answer. And so those are the issues I have with quantification. I think it can be really powerful, but I think it often gets used. Actually, it's frustrating, I suppose, that the most technologically advanced research in this is not being done by historians. And they often bring historians in afterwards to try and explain their findings when they've been asking the wrong questions.
See, now that's a really good point. It's about the questions that are being asked as opposed to the interpretation of the data. I think a lot of people in and outside of history sometimes, I don't know if they want to feel it, but they certainly get the temptation to, that the data speaks for itself and that it doesn't require that level of interpretation. And I think this is particularly important now because there's a lot of rhetoric about interpretation, and all interpretation is biased or prejudiced, or, you know, we want to just have the truth, the facts, the not the fake news. And it's difficult for me because as somebody who looks at misinformation and mistakes just honest mistakes in reportage in the 18th and early 19th century. The whole idea of fake news is very difficult for me to kind of wrap my head around the difference between a lie and a mistake. So all of these sorts of things they require historical empathy or historical understanding, and that starts with the question as opposed to just the interpretation of the data afterwards. And I think that's a really good point that you're making.
I think, yeah, so an example of it, I think that I would always say that you can almost apply the same rules as if you were analyzing one source, if you're analyzing a million of them. Right? The same methodological rigor has to go in there. You still have to be thinking, what is this source representing? How is it produced? What sort of aspect of the past is it capturing? And it's impossible to do that on an individual level for 20 million newspaper articles. But you still have to sort of think in those sort of broader principles that we would apply, or a more conventional historical analysis would apply just that one close reading. Right. You've still got to have that same skepticism, that same rigor, that same sense of what are these sources telling me? What questions can I ask them? What won't they tell me in order to make sense of the data? And I think, yeah, one of the mistakes that tends to get made, I think, is that, yeah, people treat this data as if it's neutral or pure, or it's just this enormous sort of bucket of words from which we can divine truth. And, you know, I just don't think that holds water. You wouldn't do that with one article, so why do it with 10 million?
The idea of happiness is always a really fun one with sentiment analysis, because obviously, or not obviously, but because we know that the word itself, happiness, has a very different meaning over the past 200 or 300 years. It means culturally different things, but just in terms of how it would have appeared in the dictionary, it means different things. And I think culturenomics or our various quantifications and sentiment analysis does not take into account that words don't have fixed meanings and fixed connotations. When I was doing sentiment analysis on the Battle of the Alamo with my students, we took several hundred articles about the siege of the Alamo and put them into sentiment analysis. And by and large, it came back with pretty expected results. People were sad. There was lots of talk about death. But there was a little cluster of my students who received very happy articles that were very excited, full of joy. And I said, oh, are they reprints from Mexican newspapers? Like, why are they so happy? And the students were like, no, they're horrible articles. They're all about death and destruction. And what we realized is the article had used the phrase, the military party, over and over again. And the sentiment analysis had just seen the word party and decided it was a very, very happy article. And again, that's something that never would have accidentally happened from a close reading. But if you're processing 20 million articles and you just take that result, that actually people in Louisiana were just very happy about the siege of the Alamo for no reason, it can really make a dangerous assumption about who these people were and what they were thinking.
Yeah, that's a really lovely example of that. And you're right that it's one of the things that historians, the literary scholars, linguists all would sort of take as read, right? That language changes, that it evolves incredibly quickly, and it is always dependent on its context, not even just its time, but the place in which it's been expressed. These things all change. Yeah, and I think that's an incredibly difficult thing for computational methodologies to deal with, because I mean, a lot of them are trained on Twitter, aren't they, or on modern corpuses?
Wikipedia, yeah.
Which is, I mean, again, it makes sense. Yeah, I would want all sorts of sort of. So it's interesting. There was a project that some computer scientists were working on a couple of years ago, and they brought me in towards the end to try and help interpret their data. And they were trying to sort of measure not happiness, but a whole range of other human values, whether it was like whether you were more open or closed, whether you were conservative or liberal, and it was really interesting. And they produced these amazing graphs that showed moments from 19th century newspapers where society seemed to shift politically, not necessarily in its party politics, but in its sort of broader social and cultural politics. And it was really interesting. But I couldn't get at the original data to try and figure out why. All they had was the graph at the end. So there was no way to say, all right, let's go in and look, or at least the way they were doing it. There was no way to then show me, okay, what do you mean by openness in 1880? Show me 1,000 articles that you think signify liberalism or a liberal attitude in 1840. And it hadn't occurred to them, I think, that, or at least maybe that they didn't see this as being particularly significant, that you need to sort of verify those results. For them, the theory was sound. It was based on solid kind of sociological research of how you measure these values. They'd got the data, they got the words. they produced the graph, and my God, like that, I ended up writing basically like this hasn't been published yet. I don't even know whether this research is going to get published. But I basically wrote like a 4,000 word thing saying, we don't really know what any of this means, which is not what they wanted in a scientific paper, right? So they wanted me to write the discussion bit in the middle after they'd set up the methodology. And I think what they wanted me to do was to say, this proves that in the 1880s, whatever it is, this particular change happened. And it's because of, this particular political reason. And, and I was never confident in doing that. So I framed it as, all right, this graph allows us to ask all these really interesting questions that we now need to figure out. And for me, that was great. Like, how useful to be prompted to think, to see patterns that I didn't see there before, patterns that didn't make sense. They didn't fit the established narrative. They exist, right? That data is there. It's been interpreted. Those patterns have produced something. It is measuring something, but we have no idea what. And that's where, I would want to come back down from that big picture to the small picture, and for that distant reading to inspire and inform close reading, for the theory to basically pose questions that I will then answer in a more conventional way, I guess. So it's a reciprocal thing for me, right? Like I don't want the theory on its own. I'm happy to use it if it allows me to ask new questions or to frame more robust arguments.